On Sunday, December 16, 1956, just before midnight, a 1937 model sedan raced down 35th Avenue on the southwest corner of the city of Phoenix. It went through two red lights, honking its horn in the process. The next intersection was McDowell Road and the light was green. The vehicle continued south on 35th Avenue, passing Van Buren, and up ahead there was a railroad crossing. A Southern Pacific Railroad began to cross the tracks on its way to Union Station, going 79 miles an hour. The sedan continued and slammed into the passenger train between two of its locomotives. The Southern Pacific continued to Union Station, not realizing what had happened, and upon getting there a few minutes later, the crew members found bits of human flesh in a car fender on a part of the train's undercarriage. Meanwhile, at the scene of the accident, officers had already arrived on scene and were looking for survivors. Wreckage of the car was scattered down the tracks. Bodies and body parts had landed in all directions, and some were found more than a city block away. One body was even found right next door at the Bethel Cemetery. The gruesome nature of the accident made it difficult to determine identification of the victims, let alone the number of victims. Spectators had shown up, and they had to be held back by police and sheriff's deputies while the bodies were removed. Miraculously, as they had looked for survivors, they heard the sound of a crying 18-month-old girl, and she was taken immediately to the hospital. Police determined that the sedan had 13 occupants in it when it crashed into the train. Investigators guessed that the sedan came apart by the impact with the train, as the body of the car was torn from the chassis and pancaked flat. Then the car hood had been sheared off under the windshield, and that its passengers were catapulted into the train and distributed in a gruesome pattern over a wide area. One investigator described it as like a tin can having been stepped on by a horse. Some of the bodies were so badly ripped, torn, and crushed that identification was made only by surgical scars. At the time, identification was impossible, but they were able to trace the license plate to Urbana, California, who stated that he had sold the vehicle to a man in Phoenix, and that's where they were able to get a good lead on who the victims were. In this photo, a lieutenant holds the license plate, which ends in 962, which ironically is the dispatcher's code for an auto accident with injuries. Once they were able to get all of the information, they determined that 13 occupants were in the vehicle, 12 were killed, 5 of them were men, 3 were women, and there were 4 children. 2 of the women were pregnant. The victims were Juan Alides Sr., who was 59 years old, his 2 sons, Juan Alides Jr., who was 21, and Victor Alides, who was 28. Both of their wives, Clara, who was 21, and Sophie, who was 28, and both of their children, Bobby, who was 3, and Michael, who was 8 months. Also, a man named Johnny Massey, who was 36 years old, Leroy Johnston, who was 39, and Elvira Mary Klein, she was 36. Now, Juan Alides and Victor Alides, their sister, named Cecilia Alides, she was not in the car at the time, but her 2 children were, and they both were killed. Stephen, age 11, and David, age 7. 12 killed. It was determined that the driver, Johnny Massey, had a blood alcohol level of 0.23, At the time, their legal limit was 0.15. Police were not 100% sure that he was the driver, but they were pretty certain after speaking with acquaintances, as the vehicle was his, and per the people that they spoke with, Johnny was the kind of person who would not let anyone drive his car. Johnny Massey was a 39-year-old welder, and he had tripped and fallen on Sunday, and he injured his side. And at first he refused to go to the doctor about it, but late Sunday, close to midnight, is when the pain got worse, and he decided that he was going to go to the county hospital. And at that time, he and another friend, 31-year-old Leroy Johnston, were visiting the Alitas at their home. Police could not determine a couple things. One, why so many packed into the car to go to the hospital. Number two, why he was in such a rush to get to the hospital that he was going through red lights. And most importantly, how he could not see the train or hear the train. There was no indication, based on the evidence at the scene, that the car attempted to slow down, attempted to turn. The train was going 79 miles an hour, which was legal at the time. There was no law stating that in city areas it had to go slower. The crisscross railroad sign was there. Safety experts surmised that because of the cold of the night, the windows were probably all rolled up and most likely fogged by the breath of the occupants, making it difficult to see east or west. But ultimately, there was no way of telling. Because of the accident, 6 children who were not in the car at the time were left orphaned. Their parents were Victor and Sophie, who were 28 at the time of the crash. A mass was conducted at St. Francis Cemetery in Phoenix at an altar in front of the mausoleum. All members of the Alitas family who perished in the accident were buried there. A local Boy Scouts troop, number 241, sold Christmas trees and gave the proceeds to the family. Cressida Alitas, the 18-month-old who had survived the accident, was in the hospital for quite a while, but she would eventually make a full recovery. Cecilia Alitas became guardian of the 6 children who had been orphaned. She had an offer from a wealthy California family, a couple who were ranchers, and they wanted to adopt the children for $500,000. And she declined and became their guardian. She filed a $520,000 suit against the Southern Pacific Railroad. A trial resulted in the family not receiving any money in 1958. It was appealed, though, and a couple of years later, $375,000 was awarded to Cecilia and Cressida and the remaining children who were orphaned. Cecilia would raise Cressida and 2 of the children, while the 4 remaining children would go and live with their grandmother in Colorado. In 1972, 5 of the brothers who were left orphans from the accident gathered in Phoenix to place a marker on the graves of their parents. 9 members of the Alitas family perished in the accident. They are buried at the St. Francis Cemetery in Phoenix. John Massey and Elvira Klein are buried at Tempe Butte Cemetery in Tempe, Arizona. And Leroy Johnston, he was also a welder like Massey. He is buried at the Nelson Clay Cemetery in Clay County, Arkansas. And you would never tell today, being at the location, that the worst train car casualty accident occurred at this spot. A lot of unanswered questions and a terrible tragedy here in 1956. For all of the victims, rest in peace.